I don't agree that the rules-based order is over.
Do you think Canada is a middle power? Do you think Canada is a rising power? What's Canada's play here?
Yeah, so I think Canada is a lesser power. There's very, very significant strain between Canada and the United States at the moment. We are completely tied economically, we're significantly tied militarily, and we're absolutely connected geographically. Russia, China, the United States are in strategic competition. There is competition ongoing with some of the powers in the Middle East, so between Iran and the United States, and it's all entangled.
Do you think a larger war is inevitable where these great powers, US, Russia, China, are actively engaged in direct confrontation?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's avoidable.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Christopher Coates. He was an aviator in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He retired as a lieutenant general after more than 3 decades of service. He was also the deputy commander of NORAD and the commander of Canadian Joint Operations Command. He is currently the Director of Foreign Policy, National Defense and Security at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Christopher, welcome.
Good. Yeah, welcome. It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for speaking to Fair Observer.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Today, I want to talk to you about Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos. The speech has obviously gone viral, and Prime Minister Carney says that the post-war rules-based order is over. Of course, he's referring to World War II. Now, you've spent decades in the military. You've spent decades defending the order through NATO and NORAD. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't agree that the rules-based order is over. In some ways, some parts of it are no longer as effective, but in other ways, it's still present. It's still out there, the rules-based order. It's certainly not as effective as it once was, but that didn't happen overnight. You know, the shift's been occurring for some time. And the rules-based order itself existed because states chose to follow those rules. It was a voluntary sort of thing. It was in their best interest to do that as states. And on the one hand, some parts of the rules-based order weren't followed by some of the states. And in other cases, some parts of the rule-based order just weren't sufficient to deal with the problems that were at hand. And I'd like to give you an example. At one time, I was deployed to Bosnia with the United Nations Protection Force. And we were on a UN peacekeeping mission. It was authorized under what's called Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. That chapter and that way of operating required the consent of all parties. And the mission was structured accordingly. But not everybody was in agreement. Not all the parties were in agreement, and that led to some problems in the way the mission was executed. But that didn't really stop the fact that the contributing nations, tried to exercise this Chapter 6 mission in a situation where it wasn't applicable. We tried to apply these rules where they didn't match what was happening on the ground. After 1995, the mission changed to a Chapter 7 mission, peace enforcement, where the use of force to achieve the mission was allowed. I was also there under that mandate, and it was night and day. So what does that have to do with the rules-based international order, you might say? Well, this is just a personal example, but I think during that time, there were lots of other times when military force was used, I'll say inappropriately, applying some rules that didn't match the situation. Maybe it's similar in a way to Prime Minister Carney's comments about the world as it is, as opposed to the world as we want it to be. I'm sure there were lots of other sort of similar contortions of the rules-based order that were happening around that time. So the world's been changing for a long time, but the rules haven't kept up. They didn't keep up when we were trying to apply Chapter 6 in a situation where it no longer applied. And I think there are other examples where the rules-based order wasn't matching the situation on the ground. But that doesn't mean it's not there or that it's quit, it's over. It's certainly still there. It's just that it hasn't kept up with, I think, some of the times.
Right. So you're saying the rules-based order is still there, but Prime Minister Carney is saying that Canada now has a new approach, and that is going to be value-based realism. Now, I see that as a contradiction because how can a country really defend values if it's also going to act um, how realists act? How do you see this? Can a country really do that?
Well, before going into that, and that's an interesting question, I think one of the other contradictions is that Prime Minister Carney was promoting, advocating for this idea of a values based realism after arriving from a trip to China and a trip to Qatar that don't share Canada's values or those strategic values that he identified in his speech, and came away with new strategic partnerships with these nations. And so he wasn't applying, in my view, the values based realism that he was then later advocating for. However, that aside, I think that, yeah, there does appear to be a bit of a contradiction. Maybe that's what the Prime Minister was living as you know, through the example I just mentioned. But if you were to look at the alternative would be idealism, which would be values without power or
Right.
leverage, right? Or on the other hand, absolute or amoral realism, which is all power and no values. Um, and so I think the idea of values based realism is a good compromise between the two, where the values shape which interests you apply the power against, where it shapes which partners you choose, and it shapes which tools you may choose to employ to achieve
Mhm.
your realism. So I think there's a space for values-based realism. I just don't think you should look at Canada as the personification of that, given some of these recent actions by our government.
Well, that is an interesting take. I have to give you that. But I want to talk about something that really caught all the headlines when Prime Minister Mark Carney said that there was a major rupture in the global order, in the world order. What rupture is he talking about? Is he talking about the rupture after World War II or after the Cold War? Basically, are we entering a new Cold War?
Um, well, that's an interesting question that you would pose it that way by saying, what rupture is he talking about? I think part of the problem is that rupture has not been defined. I think we need to be pretty clear about the terms we use if we want to have clear understanding. If it's just being delivered as a political buzzword, as a catchphrase to generate attention and likes, then rupture seems to work well. But I'm not so sure that it's been well defined. So, you know, is it a transition? Is it a rupture? Is it an evolution? Until rupture is well defined,
Mhm.
I think it's difficult. Your question, though, about whether we're entering a new Cold War, that one's easier to, I think, address. And so if we use the previous Cold War as the example, today's circumstances are much different. Today, there's hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, economic warfare, cyber activities and hostility. None of these really existed in the Cold War as we knew it. The Cold War was um, mm, personified by a large division between the East and the West. There was a clear demarcation between who was on what side. But today, powers are very entangled still. There isn't that separation. There is no clear delineation. So, while I would struggle to say whether you know whether the rupture has taken place, because I don't think that's well defined. If we accept that Cold War is as it was in
Mhm.
the 1950s and 60s, I don't think we're there today. Because we don't have that clear division, a clear concentration of force on two sides. There is, though, certainly into increasing and intensified strategic competition.
Mm.
Absolutely, there's no doubt that the strategic competition that's ongoing currently is super concerning. It's at the highest levels that we've seen in a long time. So while there isn't a Cold War, there is this intensified strategic competition.
Okay, so who are these strategic competitors?
Well, certainly Russia, China, the United States are in strategic competition. There is competition ongoing with some of the powers in the Middle East, so between Iran and the United States, and it's all entangled still, not in ways that the Cold War operated. Some of the not the most major powers. So if we included Russia, China, United States, there's strong competition going on between some of the higher middle powers, if you'd like, as well, and so it's part of this very competitive environment in which we find ourselves.
Okay, so where do you think Canada fits here? Do you think Canada is a middle power? Do you think Canada is a rising power? What's Canada's play here?
Yeah, so I think Canada is a lesser power in the current circumstances, and that I'm sure will offend some of my Canadian counterparts. But Canada, while we're a G7 nation and have a strong economy, we're a prosperous nation. Most of the indicators are declining at the moment. We're certainly not a military power, and in this period of rising strategic competition, I think that there are other nations that can muster more military power than Canada can, for sure. And so I think we're in the middle power band, and we're in the lower parts of that middle power category.
Okay, so I want you to tell our viewers and basically piece the puzzle together. So you've clearly highlighted the strategic competition, and you've said there's the US, there's Russia, and China. Now, can this strategic competition further create a permanent divide where you know who is on which side? If yes, where's Canada going to be?
Yeah, so I think if the divide intensifies, it will be very difficult for Canada to find itself other than allied with the United States. And why would I say that? There's very, very significant strain between Canada and the United States at the moment. And I think I would say that because we're completely tied economically, we're significantly tied militarily, and we're absolutely connected geographically.
Right.
And for Canada to try and separate itself from that is unfeasible in the current circumstances. Economically, 74% of Canada's external trade is with the United States. That isn't going to change in a significant way in the near future. Militarily, Canada is connected to the U.S. through the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and we share so much in common between the two militaries. And geographically, if Canada was not allied with the United States, we would have a significant problem on our southern border.
Right. Well, Christopher, there is a problem, and that's what Prime Minister Mark Carney really wanted to address. He's not really getting along with US President Donald Trump. In fact, Trump has been doubling down on his attacks on Canada, if not just attacking Prime Minister Carney. In fact, there are reports of Trump administration officials meeting a separatist group in Alberta. Now, there's a lot of friction happening between Ottawa and Washington. If you say that Canada has no choice but to ally with the US, how can they work together given the current scenario?
Yeah, and so the relationship has become very transactional, and I think that Canada needs to enter those transactions from a position of strength. And Canada has many assets that we can bring to the table. We're potentially an energy superpower. We have significant natural resource wealth. We provide some significant benefits to the U.S. economy. And I think the U.S. Business community understand that as well. I believe that's well known by some of the members of U.S. Congress, if that's not reflected in the language coming out of the administration. And so I think Canada is missing on the security and defense strength part of that transactional equation. So my belief is that Canada needs to very quickly rectify some of our weaknesses on the military and the defense and the security side, and then look forward to more fruitful discussions with the United States. But I think that would be business number one, is accelerating our growth and recovery of defense and security strengths, and then let's have good, solid discussions with the United States.
Right. Well, one of the friction points that has propped up has been Canada buying F-35 jets to replace its F-18 aircraft, and now there is discussion, at least on Canadian social media, that maybe it's better not to go with the F-35 jets and maybe perhaps look at Sweden for Gripen jets. Do you think that's going to happen, or do you think Canada is going to go ahead with the American jets and hope this maybe helps bring the relationship between the two countries closer?
Yeah, I think the rational discussions all favor the F-35. I'm a military aviator, and I understand the advantages of the F-35. And I don't think there's much in terms of a head-to-head competition between the two platforms. I think economically, there are good rational arguments in favor of the F-35. There are statements being made about thousands of employment opportunities if Canada was to proceed with the Saab Gripen. I look at how many people Saab employs in their assembly facility in Brazil, and that causes me to doubt those numbers. And so I think there's some good information operations occurring around the Saab Gripen, and I think those appeal to a government that right now is challenged to counter the language coming out of the White House that's offending Canadians, and it's very difficult to get past the emotional and into the rational. And so I think Canadians are very reacting very emotionally to the statements coming out of the Americans, but I think we have to look at their actions. And vis-a-vis Canada, we're still in a very much a favored position in terms of our economic trade with the U.S. And I think we should continue to pursue that. With sort of a steadfastness, and the arguments around the F-35, unfortunately, have gotten connected to these emotional concerns, emotional-based concerns about the language coming out of the White House and the administration. Canada is in a difficult position with our Air Force at the moment. And delaying the decision longer is going to reduce the options available, and so it's really a difficult spot for our Air Force if there's a decision other than the F-35. So I just unfortunate that the math doesn't allow for the other options. If we were talking about equations and transactions, and if you're just clear-headed and do the numbers, to try to consider a multiple platform option for Canada, so to have an F-35 and a Saab Gripen, for example.
Hmm.
Can't get there from here. The Canadian Air Force becomes ineffective during the transition to those two fleets. We just don't have the pilots and the people to allow that to occur. There is no viable option. So it's, I mean, I understand how excited people are around this. I can read the polls. I can sense it as I interact with Canadians. But the rational approach is F-35. Sorry, there were a series of decisions that weren't made for many years. That's our only choice at the moment.
Right. Well, one concern that Canadians are bringing up is that if the F-35 deal does go through, it could allow the Trump administration to arm twist Canada. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, but do our viewers understand how much American technology is on the Saab Gripen? And who has to release that technology to Canada? Well, it's not the Swedes. It's the Americans that have to release that technology. And so if you want to talk about arm twisting, and Canadians are familiar with the language that's come out of the American ambassador to Canada of late. Let's just wait to hear what sort of language is used if Canada decides to go for the Gripen, and we believe that we're going to get access to the engine and the radar systems and the weapons that are on that aircraft. Those all have American restricted technology on them. All
Right.
of it.
Right.
So this is not a clear picture. There is only one clear solution. Everything else is messy.
Excellent, Christopher. You've beautifully broken down Prime Minister Carney's speech. You've told us about U.S.-Canada relations. I want you to talk a little bit about the Canadian Prime Minister's visit to China. Why did it happen? Can you give us the background of why it happened? And is it significant? Is it shifting a change in the global order? Is Canada itself shifting the global order?
Yeah. So Canadian prime ministers from Pierre Trudeau in the 1970s have looked at China as an opportunity to create increased trade for Canada, and have pursued opportunities that are in Canada's interest. We produce a lot of resources that are valuable to and useful to China, and they have products that Canada is interested in, and so that trade relationship is important. Canada is a trading nation. China is a huge economy, and so that's been of interest to Canadians for some time. It's currently, let's say, 4% of Canada's external trade. So it's in terms of the numbers compared to the U.S., for example, it's not hugely significant, although it matters. It certainly matters to the canola farmers in Western Canada who are shipping large quantities of canola seed and other products to China. But I don't know that what we've seen signals a change in like some sort of a significant change in the relationship. It was mostly a return to where things were before a decline in the relationship that occurred about 10 years ago, when China exercised some very coercive actions against Canada, and relationships broke off. So perhaps it's more like a return to that. I'm a little concerned that we've returned to where we were and are exposing Canada again to some of the same coercive vulnerabilities that existed. Those haven't been talked about in terms of the relationship. So this has all been upside. There's been very little discussion of the downside. The Prime Minister talked about China being Canada's number one greatest strategic geopolitical threat less than a year ago, and there's been no mention of that. The Prime Minister talked about, prior to the visit to China, about the need for guardrails in terms of our engagement with China, but there's been no discussion really about what those guardrails are. And so I've got some concerns that we need to be dealing with China in a way that puts the security concerns far higher on the list than they appear to be at the moment.
Right. Christopher, when you spoke about strategic competition and the divide that you were seeing, I was really fascinated, and I want to prong you further on that. So when we look at the war in Ukraine, you've got Russia in there. They still hold 1/4 of land in Ukraine, and they've held the front lines for about the last 3 years now. Now Europe was actively involved in supporting Ukraine, but and so was the US. But now with the Trump administration, things have changed. The US is not actively looking to fully support Ukraine, and there is a divide here as well. How does Canada play a role?
Yeah, and which role would you be thinking of when you say, how does Canada play a role?
What role do you think Canada is playing? Do you think they're taking the European side? Do you think they're taking the American side? Or do you think they're just sitting this one out?
Yeah, so I don't think there's an American side to take on this. I think Canada's clearly expressed its position in favor of Ukraine and the right of Ukrainians to restore the sovereignty over their territory and exercise that sovereignty. And Canada has contributed per capita some of the highest amounts of funding in support of Ukraine. I think we could have done more and we could have done it better. But we've certainly been a strong ally of Ukraine throughout the period. And I don't see that changing. I'd like to see Canada be sort of front of the line in terms of what we can do to support Ukraine. That's not going to be possible, I don't think, given all the other challenges that Canada's got to perhaps arm itself before it's able to do much more in terms of supporting Ukraine. But I don't think there's much daylight between Canada and where we see ourselves in terms of supporting Ukraine. I think the Canadian population doesn't share the same threat perception that our Eastern European allies share. I think there's far more concern in the Baltic states and in Scandinavia about the threat that Russia poses. Canadians don't sense that. Canadians are rightly very outraged by Russian actions in Ukraine, but I don't think that the Canadians see this as a threat beyond that, and the way that many of our European partners see it as a threat beyond Ukraine. So I think that Canada has a role to play in supporting deterrence through the Baltic, Scandinavian, and North Atlantic to try and contain Russian and Chinese ambitions. I think that's where we should be focusing our effort, is to harden that arc against hybrid warfare, against gray zone warfare, and against military opportunities, so that there's no opportunity for Russia or China to exercise threats in that arc. So I think that's the role for Canada.
Right. Christopher, one final question to you. You've been in the military for more than 3 decades. You were part of NORAD. You were also part of NATO, and you've given us a brilliant picture of of great power competition that's happening right now. Now, there are also smaller competitions that are happening. And of course, Russia, Ukraine is one. You've got tensions in the Middle East with Iran. China and Japan are not on the same page anymore. Their tension levels are almost at the same levels as pre-World War II. So you've got multiple regions that are really hot right now, as how military terms, how military people like to call it. Do you think a larger war is inevitable, where these great powers, US, Russia, China, are actively engaged in direct confrontation?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's avoidable. I think we need to get some attention back on deterrence. And so I think our eye came off of deterrence as a requirement in the West, at least for some time. I'll say the rebalancing, the transitions that are ongoing right now, I suspect will result in a new steady state. I'm avoiding saying in a new rules-based order, but I suspect there's an adjustment of things that will take place. It won't be immediate. It won't be rapid. It won't be like a big conference after the Second World War that establishes some new rules that we all decide to follow. I think it's going to be a different way that this will happen. But I believe that we're going to see a rise in deterrence and a reduction in tensions as some new steady state is established. There may be new relationships, and they might not look like the relationships of the Cold War era, for example. But there's far more at stake now than there may have been in the past, and I think that rational actors will prevail, and that some reasonable balance will be reestablished.
Brilliant. Christopher, it was an honor and a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you very much for these amazing insights. And I'd love to have you back again and speak to us at Fair Observer and to enlighten our audience.
Thank you very much.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.